The 18-hand black stallion had sent 3 men to the hospital and was hours away from the slaughterhouse. Everyone called him Demon and refused to go near him. Sam Walker, a homeless veteran who had stopped believing he mattered to anyone, walked straight toward the fence while the auction workers screamed at him to stop. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The horse stood alone in the corner of the auction yard, its massive black frame pressed against the rusted metal fence, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. At nearly 18 hands tall, disappearing was impossible. The stallion's coat was the color of midnight, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, and its eyes burned with a wild intensity that made even the most experienced handlers step back in fear. A crude sign hung on the fence beside him, scrawled in red paint that had dripped like blood. "Demon, do not approach." The Thornton County Livestock Auction had seen its share of difficult animals over the years, but nothing quite like this one. The horse had arrived 3 weeks earlier, delivered in the middle of the night by a wealthy estate after its previous owner had died. The old man had kept the stallion isolated on his property for years, and no one knew much about the animal's history. What they did know was that in the 3 weeks since his arrival, the horse had injured 2 handlers, destroyed a portion of the stable wall, and sent 1 veterinarian to the hospital with a broken arm. The auction house had tried everything: sedatives, experienced trainers, even a so-called horse whisperer who had driven in from 2 counties away. Nothing worked. The stallion remained wild, dangerous, and utterly untouchable. Margaret Chen, the auction house manager, stood at her office window, watching the horse pace restlessly in its isolated corner. She was a practical woman, hardened by 30 years in the livestock business, but even she felt a pang of something like sadness when she looked at the animal. Tomorrow morning, if no buyer came forward, the horse would be loaded onto a truck and sent to the slaughterhouse across the state line. It was the only option left. No rescue organization would take an animal this dangerous, and the liability of keeping him any longer was becoming impossible to justify. She had made peace with the decision, or at least she told herself she had. The autumn wind carried the smell of rain across the yard as the last of the day's buyers filed out through the main gate. The auction had been slow, as it often was this time of year, and Margaret was already thinking about the paperwork waiting on her desk when she noticed a figure standing at the far end of the property, near the fence where the black horse was kept. She squinted through the dusty glass, trying to make out who would be foolish enough to approach that animal. The figure was a man, that much she could tell, wearing a faded military jacket that hung loose on his thin frame. His hair was gray and unkempt, and he carried a worn backpack over one shoulder. A homeless man, she realized, probably looking for somewhere warm to sleep. She was about to call security when something made her pause. The man wasn't trying to climb the fence or find a way inside. He was simply standing there, perfectly still, looking at the horse. And the horse, that wild and terrifying creature that had sent grown men running, was looking back. Neither of them moved. The wind picked up, sending a swirl of leaves dancing across the yard, but still they remained frozen in that strange tableau. Margaret found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't have explained why. The man's name was Samuel James Walker, though he hadn't used his full name in years. Most people just called him Sam when they called him anything at all. He was 63 years old, a veteran of a war that most people had forgotten, and he had been living on the streets for the better part of a decade. The military jacket he wore was the same one he had been issued 40 years ago, patched and repatched until it was more thread than fabric, but he refused to give it up. It was the last piece of who he used to be. Sam had wandered onto the auction property by accident, looking for a water spigot where he could fill his canteen. He had walked past the main buildings, past the cattle pens and the sheep enclosures, following a path that led to the back of the property. That was when he saw the horse. Something about the animal stopped him cold, rooted his feet to the ground as surely as if they had grown into the earth. The stallion was magnificent, a creature of pure power and beauty, but that wasn't what held Sam's attention. It was the look in the horse's eyes. Sam recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror every day for the past 40 years. It was the look of something wounded, something that had been hurt so deeply it had learned to strike first before the world could hurt it again. The horse snorted and pawed at the ground, a warning that would have sent any sensible person running. Sam didn't move. He had faced worse than an angry horse in his lifetime. He had faced things that still visited him in his nightmares, things that had broken something inside him so thoroughly that doctors had given up trying to put the pieces back together. But standing here looking at this creature that the world had labeled a demon, Sam felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt a connection. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature was beginning to drop. Sam knew he should move on, find somewhere to shelter for the night before the rain came. But his feet wouldn't obey. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a bruised apple he had found earlier that day, one of the few pieces of food he had managed to scavenge. Slowly, carefully, he approached the fence. The horse's ears flattened against its skull, and a low sound rumbled in its chest. Sam stopped, holding the apple out in his weathered palm. He didn't say anything. Words, he had learned, were often useless. Actions were what mattered. For a long moment, nothing happened. The horse stared at him with those burning eyes, muscles tensed and ready to explode into violence. Sam waited. He had nothing but time, after all. The world had stopped waiting for him long ago, so he had learned to wait for it instead. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Sam couldn't tell anymore. And then, so slowly it almost seemed like a trick of the fading light, the horse took a single step forward. Margaret Chen watched from her office window as the impossible unfolded before her eyes. The homeless man had been standing at that fence for nearly an hour now, and the horse that had terrorized everyone who came near it was slowly, impossibly moving closer. She had seen a lot of strange things in her 30 years in this business, but nothing quite like this. The stallion's head was lowered now, no longer held high in that aggressive posture that signaled imminent attack. Its ears, which had been pinned back in fury, were now pricked forward with what could only be described as curiosity. When the horse finally reached the fence and gently took the apple from the man's outstretched hand, Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She grabbed her jacket and headed outside, not entirely sure what she intended to do. The evening air was cold against her face as she crossed the yard, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The man didn't turn around as she approached, and she realized he was speaking to the horse in a low, steady voice. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who understood suffering, speaking to another who understood it just as well. "Sir," she called out when she was still a safe distance away. "Sir, that animal is dangerous. You need to step back from the fence." The man turned to look at her then, and Margaret was struck by his eyes. They were pale blue, faded like old denim, and they held a depth of weariness that made her own troubles seem small in comparison. His face was weathered and lined, a map of hard years and harder choices, but there was something gentle in his expression that didn't match the rough exterior. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was rough from disuse. "He's not dangerous," Sam said quietly. "He's scared. There's a difference." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, to tell him about the injured handlers and the destroyed stable wall, but something made her stop. The horse had moved to stand directly behind the man now, its massive head hovering just over his shoulder. Any other time, with any other person, this would have been the moment before disaster. But the stallion was calm, calmer than she had ever seen it. Its dark eyes, usually wild with fear and aggression, were fixed on the stranger with something that looked almost like trust. "Who are you?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious now. "Nobody important," Sam replied. He turned back to the horse and raised his hand slowly, letting it rest against the animal's neck. The stallion didn't flinch. What's going to happen to him? Margaret hesitated. She wasn't in the habit of sharing business details with strangers, especially homeless ones who had wandered onto her property uninvited. But there was something about this situation that defied her usual protocols. "He's scheduled to be transported tomorrow morning," she said finally, "to a processing facility." She didn't say the word slaughterhouse, she didn't have to. Sam understood immediately, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His hand continued to stroke the horse's neck in slow, rhythmic motions. "Because no one will buy him," he said. It wasn't a question. "Because no one can handle him," Margaret corrected. "We've tried everything. Trainers, veterinarians, specialists. He's hurt people. Good people who were just trying to help him. The liability alone." She trailed off, feeling suddenly defensive about a decision she had made with clear logic and sound business sense. "There's nothing else we can do." Sam was quiet for a long time. The wind had picked up, carrying the first drops of rain on its breath, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled like a sleeping giant stirring. The horse pressed closer to Sam, seeking warmth or comfort, or perhaps both. Finally, Sam spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "How much?" Margaret blinked. "Excuse me." "To buy him. How much would it cost?" She almost laughed. The idea was absurd. This man clearly had nothing, no money, no home, no means to care for himself, let alone a 1,000-pound animal with a history of violence. But something in his expression stopped her. He was completely serious, and more than that, he was completely certain, like a man who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "Sir, even if you could afford him, which—" She paused, trying to find a diplomatic way to state the obvious. "Even if you could, where would you keep him? How would you feed him? A horse like this requires resources, facilities, expertise. You can't just—" "How much?" Sam repeated, and this time there was steel in his voice. It was the voice of a man who had once commanded others, who had made decisions that meant life or death. Margaret recognized authority when she heard it, even when it came wrapped in a threadbare jacket and worn-out boots. She sighed. Normally, a horse like this, with his bloodlines, would go for thousands. But given the circumstances, she shook her head. "Look, if someone could prove they could handle him, could give him a proper home, I'd practically give him away just to avoid the alternative. But that's not possible. No one can handle him." Sam turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something like a smile cross his weathered face. "I can." The rain began to fall in earnest now, fat drops that splattered against the dusty ground and darkened the horse's midnight coat. Margaret stood there getting wet, watching as the homeless veteran and the horse that everyone called Demon stood together in the downpour, neither one of them seeming to notice or care. There was a story here, she realized, a story about two broken things finding each other in the darkness. She just wasn't sure yet how it would end. "Come to my office," she said finally, surprising herself. "Let's get out of this rain and talk." Sam nodded once, then turned to the horse. "I'll be back," he said softly. "I promise." The stallion watched him go, and for the first time since arriving at the auction house, it didn't pace or rage against its confinement. It simply stood there in the rain, waiting, as if it understood that something had changed. Margaret's office was small and cluttered, filled with years of accumulated paperwork and faded photographs of horses long since sold. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine that had seen better days and handed one to Sam, who accepted it with a nod of gratitude. His hands, she noticed, were steady despite the cold. They were working hands, scarred and calloused, hands that had known labor and hardship. He wrapped them around the warm cup and took a slow sip, his eyes drifting to a photograph on her wall showing a young woman standing beside a chestnut mare. "My daughter," Margaret said, following his gaze. "That picture's 20 years old now. She lives in California, has her own family." She settled into her chair and studied the man across from her. "You served, didn't you? I can always tell." Sam nodded slowly. "Long time ago. Vietnam. 3 tours." He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or shame, just a simple statement of history. Came back different like most of us did. Spent years trying to fit into a world that didn't quite fit anymore. Eventually, stopped trying. Margaret had heard similar stories before. Her own father had served in Korea, and he had carried his ghosts until the day he died. She understood, at least in part, what it meant to come home from war and find that home had become a foreign country. "And now you live on the streets," she said, not unkindly. "I live where I can," Sam replied. "The streets, the shelters when they have room, the woods when the weather's good. I don't need much, never did." He set down his coffee cup and met her eyes directly. "But that horse needs something. He needs someone who understands what it's like to be written off by the world. I know what that feels like, Mrs. Chen. I've been feeling it for 40 years. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. Every instinct she had developed over 3 decades in this business told her this was a bad idea. The man had no money, no home, no resources. He couldn't possibly provide for a horse, especially one as troubled as this one. And yet, she had seen what happened at that fence. She had watched a creature that had nearly killed people become calm and docile in his presence. That meant something. It had to mean something. "Tell me something," she said. "That horse has been here 3 weeks. He's attacked everyone who's come near him. Experienced trainers, people who've worked with difficult animals their whole lives. But he let you touch him. He took food from your hand. How?" Sam was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to answer. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost distant. "When I was overseas, I saw things, did things that changed me in ways I can't explain and don't like to talk about. When I came back, I was angry, scared. I lashed out at everyone who tried to help because I couldn't tell the difference between someone trying to hurt me and someone trying to save me. It took a long time to learn that difference. Some days, I'm still learning." He paused, looking out the rain-streaked window toward the yard where the black stallion stood waiting. "That horse isn't mean, Mrs. Chen. He's not a demon. He's just been hurt, probably badly, probably for a long time. He's learned that the world is dangerous and that people can't be trusted. So he fights. He fights because that's the only way he knows how to survive. But fighting takes everything out of you. Eventually, you get tired. You start hoping, even when you know you shouldn't, that someone will see past the anger and recognize what's underneath." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a softening she hadn't expected. She had run this auction house with pragmatism and efficiency, making hard decisions because someone had to make them. But sitting here listening to this broken man talk about a broken horse, she found herself wanting to believe in something more than practicality. "Even if I wanted to help you," she said slowly, "I don't see how it could work. You can't keep a horse in a shopping cart." The ghost of a smile crossed Sam's face. No, ma'am, you can't. But I've been thinking about that. There's an old man named Henry Dawson who has a farm about 3 miles from here. I've done work for him before, odd jobs, fixing fences, clearing brush. He's let me sleep in his barn during the bad winters. I think if I talked to him, explained the situation, he might be willing to let the horse stay there. I could work off the cost of his feed and care." Margaret raised an eyebrow. She knew Henry Dawson, had sold him a few animals over the years. He was a decent man, getting on in years, with more land than he could properly manage anymore. It wasn't the craziest idea she had ever heard. "And what about you?" she asked. "Where would you stay?" "With the horse," Sam said simply. "In the barn. That's all I need. A roof over my head and something worth waking up for." He leaned forward, and there was an intensity in his pale eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Chen, I know how this looks. I know I'm not the kind of person anyone would trust with anything valuable. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. Give us both a chance. That horse deserves better than to end up in a slaughterhouse, and I..." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I need this. I need to matter to something again." The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean and glistening. Margaret looked at the man sitting across from her, seeing past the worn clothes and the weathered face to something deeper. She saw desperation, yes, but also determination. She saw a man who had lost almost everything but hadn't quite given up hope. And she thought about the horse in the yard, that magnificent, terrifying creature that had shown gentleness for the first time in weeks. "All right," she heard herself say. "I'll give you 1 week. If you can prove you can handle him, if Henry Dawson agrees to let you use his property, I'll sell you the horse for $1. But if anything goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, the deal is off. Understood?" Sam's face transformed. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Understood," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You won't regret this." Margaret wasn't entirely sure about that, but as she watched him stand and head for the door, she found herself hoping against all logic and experience that she had made the right choice. The walk to Henry Dawson's farm took Sam just over an hour, his worn boots squelching through mud left behind by the evening rain. The night air was cold and sharp, filled with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves, and the stars were beginning to emerge from behind the retreating clouds. Sam walked with purpose, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. For years, his movements had been aimless, driven by nothing more than the need to find food or shelter. But tonight, he had a destination. He had a mission. And somewhere behind him, in a rain-soaked auction yard, a black horse was waiting for him to succeed. Henry Dawson's property appeared at the end of a long dirt road, marked by a weathered mailbox that leaned slightly to one side. The farmhouse was modest, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Beyond it, Sam could see the silhouettes of a barn and several outbuildings, dark shapes against the starlit sky. A single light burned in one of the downstairs windows, a warm yellow glow that spoke of life and warmth inside. Sam hesitated at the edge of the property, suddenly aware of how he must look. His clothes were damp and dirty, his hair uncombed, his face unshaven. He was asking a lot, he knew. Asking a man to trust him with shelter and responsibility when he had nothing to offer in return but his word and his willingness to work. But he had come too far to turn back now. He thought of the horse's eyes, dark and deep, and filled with a pain that mirrored his own, and he forced himself to keep walking. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he climbed them, and before he could knock, the front door swung open. Henry Dawson stood in the doorway, a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. He was in his 70s, lean and weathered like old leather, with white hair that stuck out in wild tufts around his ears. His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Sam with a mixture of wariness and recognition. "Sam Walker," Henry said after a moment. "Didn't expect to see you tonight. You in some kind of trouble?" "No, sir," Sam replied, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Just came to talk, if you have a few minutes." Henry considered this, then lowered the shotgun and stepped back from the door. "Coffee's still hot. Come on in before you catch your death." The inside of the farmhouse was cluttered but clean, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Photographs covered nearly every surface, showing smiling faces and captured moments that spanned decades. Henry led Sam to the kitchen, where a pot of coffee sat on an old stove, and poured 2 cups without asking. They sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table, and Henry waited in silence for Sam to speak. Sam wrapped his hands around the warm cup and gathered his thoughts. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say during the long walk here, but now the words seemed inadequate. Finally, he just started talking, telling Henry about the auction house and the Black Horse and Margaret Chen's offer. He told him about the connection he had felt, that instant recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in a body that the world had deemed worthless. He told him about the slaughterhouse truck coming in the morning and the $1 deal that depended on finding a place where the horse could stay. Henry listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When Sam finished, the old farmer was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if searching for answers in its dark surface. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, counting off seconds that felt like hours. "That's quite a story," Henry said finally. "You're asking me to take in a dangerous animal and let you live in my barn like some kind of hired hand from another century." "I'm asking you to give us both a chance," Sam replied. "I know it's a lot. I know I don't have any right to ask. But that horse is going to die tomorrow if I can't find a place for him, and He stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I haven't felt like I had a purpose in a very long time, Henry. This feels like one. Maybe the last one I'll ever have." Henry set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, studying Sam with those sharp old eyes. "I remember when you first came around here, must be 6 or 7 years ago now. You were just passing through, looking for work. I didn't expect you to stay, but you did. Fixed my fences better than any man I've hired since, never asked for more than a meal and a place to sleep." He paused, shaking his head slowly. "I never understood how a man like you ended up the way you did. You clearly had skills, had training, could have made something of yourself." Sam looked down at his hands, at the scars and calluses that mapped his history. "The war took something from me, Henry, something I never got back. When I came home, I couldn't hold down a job, couldn't keep a relationship, couldn't stay in one place without the walls starting to close in. Eventually, I stopped fighting it, stopped trying to be what everyone expected me to be, and just started surviving instead." Henry nodded slowly, as if this explanation made sense to him in a way that words couldn't fully capture. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of his property. The barn stood solid and waiting in the moonlight, its doors closed against the night. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Since then, this place has gotten too big for one old man. I've thought about selling, but I can't bring myself to do it. Too many memories here." He turned back to face Sam, and there was something new in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. Maybe having someone around would be good. Someone to help with the chores, keep an eye on things. And if that someone happens to come with a horse, he shrugged his thin shoulders. "Well, I've always liked horses." Sam felt his heart surge with a gratitude so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "You mean it? You'll let us stay?" Henry held up a hand. "I'll let you try. 1 week, like that Chen woman said. If the horse causes trouble, if anyone gets hurt, the deal's off. But if you can make it work." He extended his hand across the table. "Then you've got yourself a home, Sam Walker. You and that demon horse of yours." The sun was barely above the horizon when Sam arrived back at the auction house the next morning. He had slept in Henry's barn, wrapped in an old horse blanket that smelled of hay and better times, and had risen before dawn to make the walk back. Margaret Chen was already in her office when he appeared at her door, and the look on her face told him she hadn't expected him to return. She had probably assumed he would disappear into the night like so many promises made in moments of desperation. But Sam had never broken a promise in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. Henry Dawson said yes, Sam announced without preamble. He's got a barn with an empty stall and pasture land that hasn't been used in years. I'll work for him in exchange for the horse's keep. Room and board for both of us. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook her head with something that might have been admiration. You actually did it. I didn't think you would, but you did. She rose from her desk and pulled a single sheet of paper from a drawer. This is a bill of sale. Sign here and the horse is yours for $1. Sam reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled dollar bill, one he had been saving for emergencies. He smoothed it out carefully and placed it on Margaret's desk, then signed his name in a hand that was surprisingly steady. Samuel James Walker. It had been years since he had written his full name. It felt like reclaiming something that had been lost. The transport was arranged for later that morning. Margaret had called in a favor from a local hauler, a man who owed her for some past kindness and was willing to take on the risk of moving the dangerous stallion. Sam insisted on being the one to load the horse, over the protests of everyone present. The handlers who had been injured kept their distance, watching from behind the safety of fences and buildings as Sam walked alone into the enclosure where the black horse waited. The stallion was agitated, pacing back and forth with nervous energy. The commotion of the morning, the strangers and vehicles and raised voices had set him on edge. His ears were pinned back and his eyes rolled with barely contained fear. But when Sam stepped through the gate, speaking in that low, steady voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, the horse stopped. It stood still, watching, every muscle tense and ready for flight or fight. Easy now, Sam murmured, approaching slowly with his hand extended. I know you're scared. I know this doesn't make sense, but I need you to trust me, just a little bit. Can you do that? Can you trust me enough to follow me out of here? The horse snorted, stamping one massive hoof against the ground. Sam didn't flinch. He had faced artillery fire and ambushes, had walked through jungles where death waited behind every tree. A frightened horse, no matter how large or powerful, didn't compare. He reached the stallion's side and placed his hand on that midnight neck, feeling the muscles quiver beneath the sleek coat. For a moment they simply stood there together, man and horse, breathing the same air, sharing the same fear. Then, slowly, Sam reached for the lead rope that hung on a nearby post. He clipped it to the halter that the handlers had managed to get on the horse days ago, and with gentle pressure he began to walk toward the gate. The horse followed. Not eagerly, not without hesitation, but it followed. Step by step, they made their way across the yard to where the trailer waited, its ramp lowered and ready. Sam didn't look back at the watching crowd. His entire focus was on the animal beside him, on maintaining that fragile thread of trust that connected them. Loading the horse into the trailer was the hardest part. The confined space, the strange smells, the rumble of the truck's engine all combined to push the stallion to the edge of panic. Twice he reared back, nearly pulling the rope from Sam's hands. Twice Sam held on, speaking constantly in that calm, even tone, refusing to give up. On the third try, with Sam leading the way up the ramp and the horse following so close that Sam could feel its breath on his neck, they made it inside. Sam secured the horse and stepped out, closing the trailer door behind him. Margaret was waiting for him, her arms crossed over her chest. I've been doing this for 30 years, she said quietly. I've never seen anything like that. Sam wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of him, he said. Fear feeds fear. If I had gone in there scared, he would have known. He would have reacted to it. The drive to Henry's farm took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Sam rode in the back with the horse, keeping his hand on the animal's flank to steady him through the turns and bumps of the road. By the time they arrived, the stallion was drenched in sweat and trembling, but he was calm. He had survived the journey, and more importantly, he had survived it without hurting anyone. Henry was waiting at the barn when the trailer pulled up. He watched in silence as Sam unloaded the horse and led him into the prepared stall, a spacious enclosure with fresh straw and clean water. The stallion entered cautiously, his nostrils flaring as he took in the new scents and surroundings. But he didn't panic. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, looking at Sam with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if asking what came next. "Welcome home," Sam said softly, reaching through the stall bars to stroke the horse's face. "I know it doesn't feel like home yet, but it will. I promise you, it will." Henry appeared at his shoulder, looking at the horse with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "He's a big one, isn't he? What are you going to call him? Can't keep calling him Demon." Sam considered the question. He thought about the darkness the horse had known, the fear and pain and abandonment, and he thought about what he hoped lay ahead for both of them. "Angel," he said finally. "I'm going to call him Angel." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Angel? That's quite a change from Demon." Sam smiled, the expression unfamiliar but not unwelcome on his weathered face. Sometimes a change is exactly what's needed. The first few days at Henry's farm were a test of patience and perseverance. Angel remained wary of his new surroundings, startling at sudden sounds and pacing his stall with restless energy. Sam spent nearly every waking moment with him, sitting outside the stall door, speaking in that low, constant voice that seemed to soothe the stallion's frayed nerves. He told Angel about his life, about the war and the years that followed, about the things he had seen and done and lost. The horse couldn't understand the words, of course, but he seemed to understand the tone, the emotion behind them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in his massive body began to ease. Henry watched from a distance, careful not to interfere with the bond that was forming. He brought meals out to the barn for Sam, simple fare of sandwiches and coffee, and sometimes he would sit on an overturned bucket and listen to Sam talk to the horse. It reminded him of something his wife used to say, that the best conversations were the ones where words weren't really necessary. There was a communication happening between the man and the horse that transcended language, a mutual recognition of shared wounds and shared hope. By the third day, Angel would approach the stall door when Sam appeared, his ears pricked forward with something that looked like anticipation. By the fourth day, Sam was able to enter the stall without the horse retreating to the far corner. They would stand together in the dim light, Sam's weathered hand resting on Angel's neck, both of them breathing slowly and steadily, as if synchronized by some invisible force. It was during these moments that Sam felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the absence of pain or memory, but a genuine sense of calm that seemed to radiate from the horse and into his own troubled soul. The nightmares still came, of course. They always did. Sam would wake in the small hours of the morning, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, the sounds of gunfire and screaming still echoing in his ears. But now, when he stumbled out of his makeshift bed in the corner of the barn, Angel was there. The horse would press his great head against Sam's chest, breathing warm air onto his trembling hands, standing solid and real and present, until the memories faded back into the darkness where they belonged. It was as if the horse understood, as if he knew what it meant to be haunted by things that couldn't be outrun. On the fifth day, Sam decided it was time to try something new. He had found an old halter and lead rope in Henry's tack room, dusty from years of disuse, and he spent the morning cleaning and conditioning the leather until it was soft and supple. Then, with Henry watching anxiously from the barn door, he entered Angel's stall and slowly, carefully slipped the halter over the horse's head. Angel stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Sam's face, trusting him in a way that made Sam's heart ache. They walked together out of the barn and into the morning sunlight. It was Angel's first time outside since arriving at the farm, and for a moment, the horse froze, overwhelmed by the open space and the unfamiliar sensations. Sam waited, giving him time to adjust, and then gently urged him forward. Step by step, they made their way across the yard to the small pasture that Henry had fenced off years ago for a horse he had never gotten around to buying. The gate stood open, an invitation to freedom. Sam unclipped the lead rope and stepped back. Angel stood motionless as if uncertain what was expected of him. Then, with a snort that might have been surprise or joy, the stallion broke into a run. He galloped across the pasture with a power and grace that took Sam's breath away, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his mane streaming behind him like a dark flag. He ran in great circles, kicking up his heels, releasing energy that had been pent up for far too long. And then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He turned to look at Sam, who still stood by the gate, and he walked back. Not because he had to, not because he was forced, but because he chose to. Henry appeared at Sam's side, his eyes wide with wonder. "Would you look at that?" he murmured. "He came back to you. He actually came back." Sam nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had spent so many years running, so many years trying to escape from himself and his past. And here was this horse, this magnificent creature that had every reason to run and never look back, choosing to return, choosing connection over freedom, trust over fear. It was a lesson Sam hadn't known he needed to learn. The days that followed brought continued progress. Sam began working with Angel in the pasture, teaching him basic commands through patience and repetition rather than force. The horse responded eagerly, as if hungry for the structure and purpose that training provided. Henry, who had initially kept his distance, began to venture closer, and soon Angel accepted him as well, not with the same deep bond he shared with Sam, but with a quiet tolerance that spoke of growing trust. Word began to spread through the small community about the homeless veteran and the demon horse he had tamed. People would drive by the farm slowly, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the black stallion in the pasture. Some stopped to talk, curious about the story behind the unlikely pair. Sam, who had spent years avoiding human contact, found himself opening up to these strangers, telling them about Angel and the auction house and the chance that Margaret Chen had given them both. Each conversation was a small step back toward the world he had abandoned so long ago. On the 7th day, Margaret Chen herself drove out to the farm. She had called ahead, wanting to see for herself whether the impossible had actually happened. When she arrived, she found Sam and Angel in the pasture, the man sitting on the fence while the horse grazed peacefully nearby. The transformation was remarkable. The wild, dangerous animal she had nearly sent to slaughter was gone, replaced by a creature that radiated calm and contentment. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "You did it, Sam. You actually did it." Sam smiled, watching Angel move through the golden afternoon light. "We did it together," he said. "He saved me just as much as I saved him." Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Sam and Angel only grew stronger. The autumn leaves fell and carpeted the ground in shades of gold and crimson, and then winter arrived with its bitter winds and heavy snows. Sam had worried about the cold, about how Angel would fare in the harsh weather, but Henry's barn proved sturdy and warm. They spent the long winter nights together, man and horse, listening to the wind howl outside while they remained safe and sheltered within. Sam had never known such contentment. For the first time in 40 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The people of the community had embraced the story of Sam and Angel as their own. Local newspapers had run articles about the homeless veteran and the horse that everyone called Demon, and donations had begun to trickle in. Bags of feed appeared on Henry's doorstep, along with blankets and veterinary supplies and even a new winter coat for Sam. A local church organized a fundraiser that raised enough money to cover Angel's care for an entire year. Sam, who had spent so long feeling invisible, suddenly found himself the center of attention, and while it made him uncomfortable at times, he was grateful for the kindness. It was on a gray February morning that the trouble arrived. Sam was in the barn, brushing Angel's winter coat when he heard the sound of vehicles coming up the drive. He looked out to see two expensive SUVs pulling to a stop in front of Henry's farmhouse, their black paint gleaming against the snow. Several men in suits emerged, along with a woman in a fur coat who surveyed the property with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Sam felt his stomach tighten with an instinct honed by years of hard experience. These were not friendly visitors. Henry met them on the porch, his shotgun conspicuously absent but his posture stiff with wariness. Sam couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the old farmer shaking his head repeatedly, his arms crossed over his chest in a gesture of refusal. After several minutes of heated discussion, Henry pointed toward the barn, and the group began walking in Sam's direction. Sam stepped out to meet them, positioning himself between the visitors and the barn door where Angel waited. The woman in the fur coat stopped a few feet away, her eyes cold and appraising. She was in her 50s, with perfectly styled hair and jewelry that probably cost more than Sam had earned in his entire life. Behind her, the suited men arranged themselves like bodyguards, their faces impassive. "You must be the vagrant who stole my horse," the woman said, her voice dripping with contempt. Sam felt Angel press against the barn door behind him, sensing the tension. "I didn't steal anything, ma'am. I bought him legally from the county auction." The woman laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "That horse belonged to my late father, Richard Harrington. He was a champion, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars before his injury. When my father died, the estate was supposed to liquidate all assets, including the horses. But someone made a mistake, and this particular animal ended up at a public auction instead of going to a proper buyer." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I want him back." Sam stood his ground, though his heart was pounding. "With all due respect, ma'am, your father's estate gave up that horse. They knew he was damaged, knew he was dangerous, and they dumped him at an auction to avoid the trouble of dealing with him. I bought him fair and square, and I have the paperwork to prove it." One of the suited men stepped forward, holding a sheaf of documents. "Ms. Harrington's lawyers have reviewed the situation. There are irregularities in the sale that could invalidate your purchase. We're prepared to take this to court if necessary." Sam felt the ground shifting beneath him, the fragile security he had built threatening to crumble. He thought about all the progress he and Angel had made, about the trust they had built and the peace they had found. The idea of losing it all, of watching Angel be taken back to a life of neglect and exploitation, filled him with a cold fury. "That horse was headed to slaughter," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Your father's estate didn't care what happened to him. No one did. They called him a demon and treated him like garbage. I'm the one who saw his worth. I'm the one who gave him a chance." The woman's expression didn't change. "Sentimental nonsense. That animal has value. Breeding rights alone could be worth a fortune. I'm not going to let some homeless drifter profit from my family's property." She turned to the suited men. "File the papers. We'll let the courts decide." After they left, Sam stood in the frozen yard, watching the SUVs disappear down the road. Henry came to stand beside him, his weathered face creased with concern. "What are we going to do, Sam? Those people have money, lawyers, connections. We can't fight that." Sam was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tire tracks in the snow. Then he turned and walked back into the barn, where Angel waited with anxious eyes. The horse nickered softly as Sam approached, pressing his muzzle against Sam's chest in that gesture of comfort that had become so familiar. I don't know what's going to happen," Sam said softly, wrapping his arms around Angel's neck. "But I'm not giving up. I didn't survive 3 tours in Vietnam, didn't survive 40 years of hell on earth just to lose you to some rich woman who sees you as nothing but a dollar sign." He pulled back and looked into Angel's dark eyes, seeing there the same fierce determination that burned in his own heart. They had both been written off by the world, both been labeled as worthless and dangerous. But together, they had proven everyone wrong, and Sam would be damned if he let anyone tear them apart now. "We're going to fight," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we're going to fight." Angel snorted and tossed his head as if in agreement. And standing there in the quiet barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the warmth of his companion, Sam began to plan. The news of the legal battle spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, Sam found himself at the center of a groundswell of support he had never anticipated. People who had followed his story, who had been moved by the tale of the homeless veteran and the horse called Demon, rallied to his cause. A local attorney named Patricia Reyes, a young woman with fierce eyes and a reputation for taking on impossible cases, offered to represent him pro bono. She had read about Sam and Angel in the newspaper and had been so moved that she couldn't stand by and watch injustice prevail. Patricia arrived at Henry's farm on a cold morning, her briefcase tucked under her arm and determination written across her face. She spent hours interviewing Sam, taking notes, and examining every piece of documentation related to Angel's purchase. When she finally looked up from her papers, there was a gleam in her eye that gave Sam his first real hope since Victoria Harrington's visit. "They have money and influence," Patricia said, "but we have something better. We have the truth, and we have a community that believes in you. The sale was legal, the paperwork is in order, and most importantly, we can prove that the estate willfully abandoned this animal. They can't just change their minds now that he's valuable again." The weeks that followed were a blur of legal filings and court appearances. Sam, who had spent years avoiding any interaction with the system, found himself sitting in courtrooms and meeting with lawyers, his weathered face captured by news cameras as the story gained national attention. It was overwhelming and exhausting, but every night he would return to the barn, to Angel, and find the strength to continue. The horse seemed to sense the stress Sam was under, and he would stand close, his warm breath a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. Victoria Harrington's lawyers were relentless. They argued that the estate sale had been conducted improperly, that the auction house had no right to sell such a valuable animal for a single dollar, that Sam was an unfit owner who had essentially stolen property. They painted him as a con artist, a manipulator who had taken advantage of a clerical error to enrich himself. The accusations stung, but Sam refused to let them break him. He had faced worse enemies in his life. The turning point came when Patricia managed to obtain records from the Harrington estate. What she found changed everything. Documents showed that Richard Harrington, Victoria's father, had specifically instructed in his will that all his horses be cared for properly or released to sanctuaries if no suitable buyers could be found. The estate managers had ignored these wishes, choosing instead to dump the injured animals at low-end auctions to maximize quick profits. Angel wasn't the only horse who had suffered this fate, just the only one who had survived it. When this evidence was presented in court, the tide began to turn. Local news stations ran stories about the Harrington estate's pattern of animal neglect. Former employees came forward with testimonies about the harsh conditions at the Harrington stables, about horses worked until they broke and then discarded like used equipment. Victoria Harrington, who had presented herself as a grieving daughter seeking to reclaim her father's beloved horse, was exposed as someone who had never shown any interest in the animals until she learned they might be worth money. The judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Price, who had seen her share of frivolous lawsuits, was clearly moved by the evidence. During the final hearing, she looked at Victoria Harrington with undisguised contempt before delivering her ruling. The sale was valid, she declared. Sam Walker was the legal owner of the horse known as Angel, formerly Demon, and no further claims against his ownership would be entertained by the court. Sam sat in stunned silence as the courtroom erupted in cheers. Patricia was smiling, Henry was wiping tears from his weathered cheeks, and strangers were reaching out to shake Sam's hand and pat his shoulder. He felt disconnected from it all, as if watching from a great distance. It wasn't until he returned to the farm, until he walked into the barn and saw Angel waiting for him with those deep, knowing eyes, that the reality finally hit him. They had won. Against all odds, against money and power, and a system that rarely favored people like him, they had won. That night, Sam sat in Angel's stall with his back against the wooden wall, the horse standing over him like a guardian. The barn was quiet, except for the soft sounds of Angel's breathing and the distant hoot of an owl. Sam looked up at the stars visible through the window, the same stars he had looked at during countless cold nights on the street, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone beneath them. "We did it, Angel," he said softly. "We actually did it." The horse lowered his great head and pressed his muzzle against Sam's shoulder, breathing warm air onto his neck. It was a gesture of comfort, of connection, of something that might have been love if such a word could apply to the bond between a man and a horse. Sam closed his eyes and let the peace wash over him, a peace he had searched for his entire adult life and had finally found in the most unexpected place. The victory in court was not just a legal triumph. It was a validation of everything Sam had believed in, everything he had fought for. It proved that the world, for all its cruelty and indifference, still had room for justice. It proved that broken things could be mended, that discarded lives could find new purpose, that it was never too late for a second chance. And as Sam sat there in the quiet barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the warmth of his companion, he made a silent promise. He would spend the rest of his days proving that the faith people had placed in him was not misplaced. He would honor Angel's trust, Henry's kindness, Patricia's dedication, and the support of all those strangers who had believed in their story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, Sam allowed himself to simply be grateful. Grateful for the horse who had saved him, for the home he had found, for the life that had opened up before him like a road stretching toward the horizon. And somewhere in the darkness, Angel nickered softly, as if to say he was grateful too. Spring arrived with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation that had taken place at Henry Dawson's farm. The snow melted into streams that fed the awakening earth, and green shoots pushed up through the dark soil as if reaching for the warmth of the sun. Angel, now fully recovered from years of neglect, had grown into a magnificent creature. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, his muscles rippled beneath his skin with every movement, and his eyes, once wild with fear and rage, now held a calm intelligence that amazed everyone who saw him. The horse that had been called Demon was gone forever, replaced by something beautiful and strong and full of life. Sam had changed too, though perhaps not as visibly. The haunted look that had lived in his eyes for 40 years had softened, replaced by something that might have been peace or might have been purpose. He had put on weight, his frame filling out from regular meals and steady work. His gray hair, once wild and unkempt, was now trimmed and neat. He still wore his old military jacket, patched and faded, but he wore it with pride now rather than desperation. It was no longer a remnant of who he used to be. It was a reminder of how far he had come. The court victory had brought unexpected opportunities. A local television station had done a feature story on Sam and Angel, and the piece had gone viral. Suddenly, people from across the country were reaching out, wanting to help, wanting to be part of their story. Donations poured in, enough to build a proper stable and expand the pasture. A veterinarian offered free care for Angel for as long as Sam needed it. A feed company provided supplies at cost. The community that had initially rallied around them continued to grow, extending far beyond the borders of their small town. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. A veterans organization had seen the news coverage and reached out to Sam with a proposal. They wanted to start a program using horses to help other veterans struggling with trauma and reintegration. Equine therapy, they called it, had shown remarkable results in treating conditions like the ones Sam had battled his entire adult life. They wanted Sam and Angel to be the foundation of this new initiative, to help others find the same healing that they had found in each other. Sam was hesitant at first. The idea of opening up his world, of sharing Angel with strangers, went against every instinct he had developed over years of isolation. But then he thought about all those nights he had spent alone on the streets, all those years he had wasted because no one had reached out to help him. He thought about the other veterans out there, men and women carrying the same invisible wounds, fighting the same silent battles. If he could help even one of them find peace, wasn't it worth the risk? The program launched in early summer, with Sam and Angel at its heart. Veterans began arriving at the farm, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, some showing no visible injuries at all, but carrying damage that ran far deeper than flesh and bone. Sam met each one with the same patience and understanding he had shown Angel on that first night at the auction yard. He didn't push them or rush them or try to fix them. He simply introduced them to Angel and let the horse work his quiet miracle. The results were extraordinary. Men who hadn't spoken in months began to open up while grooming Angel's coat. Women who flinched at every sudden sound found peace standing in his calm presence. There was something about the horse, something in his patient eyes and gentle nature that seemed to reach past the walls these veterans had built around themselves. Angel didn't judge them or expect anything from them. He simply accepted them, just as Sam had accepted him, and in that acceptance they began to find themselves again. Henry watched it all unfold from his porch, a smile on his weathered face. His farm, which had been quiet and lonely since his wife's passing, was now full of life and purpose. Volunteers came regularly to help with the program, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. He had given Sam a chance out of kindness and perhaps loneliness, never imagining that it would lead to something so much greater than himself. Now, in the twilight of his years, he had become part of something meaningful, something that would continue long after he was gone. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Sam stood at the pasture fence watching Angel graze. Patricia Reyes had stopped by to check on the program, and she joined him at the fence, her legal work long since completed, but her connection to the farm remaining strong. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the magnificent black horse move through the golden light. "You know," Patricia said finally, "when I first took your case, I thought I was just helping a man keep his horse. I had no idea it would turn into all this." Sam nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Angel. "Neither did I. I just wanted to save him. I never thought he would end up saving so many others, including yourself," Patricia added softly. Sam was quiet for a moment, considering her words. It was true, of course. Angel had saved him in ways he was still discovering. The horse had given him a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose to guide his days, a connection to break through the isolation that had nearly destroyed him. But more than that, Angel had taught him something he had forgotten long ago. He had taught him that it was possible to trust again, to hope again, to believe that the world held more than just pain and disappointment. "Yeah," Sam said finally, a smile crossing his weathered face. "Including myself." Angel lifted his head at the sound of Sam's voice and walked over to the fence. He pressed his muzzle against Sam's chest in that familiar gesture of affection, and Sam wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, breathing in his warm, earthy scent. This was home now. This was where he belonged. And for the first time in his life, Sam Walker knew exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. 5 years had passed since Sam Walker first laid eyes on a black horse, standing alone in the corner of an auction yard. 5 years since he had seen something in those wild, frightened eyes that no one else could see. 5 years since he had made a promise to a creature that the world had written off as worthless and dangerous. Looking back now, standing in the morning light with his hand resting on Angel's neck, Sam could barely recognize the man he had been. That broken, homeless veteran who had wandered onto the auction property looking for water seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. And in many ways, he was. The farm had grown beyond anything Sam could have imagined. What had started as a simple arrangement with Henry Dawson had evolved into the Angel's Hope Veterans Sanctuary, a fully operational facility that had helped hundreds of veterans find healing through their connection with horses. The original barn had been expanded, new stables built, and the pastures extended to accommodate a dozen rescue horses, each one with a story of survival that mirrored Angel's own. Volunteers came from all over the county to help, and the waiting list of veterans seeking admission to the program stretched months into the future. Henry Dawson had passed away 2 winters ago, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81. He had left the farm to Sam in his will, a final gift from a man who had become like a father to him. Sam had wept at the funeral, the first tears he had shed in decades, and he had made a promise at Henry's grave to honor his memory by continuing the work they had started together. The farmhouse, once quiet and empty, now served as the program's headquarters, its walls covered with photographs of veterans who had found hope within its boundaries. Margaret Chen visited regularly, having retired from the auction house but unable to stay away from the story she had helped begin. She would sit on the porch with Sam, drinking coffee and marveling at how far they had come from that rainy night when a homeless man had asked to buy a dangerous horse for $1. Patricia Reyes had moved on to bigger cases and greater challenges, but she still called on holidays and sent donations when she could. They were all part of something larger now, a tapestry of lives woven together by chance and choice and the stubborn refusal to give up on things that others deemed hopeless. Angel, at 15 years old, was no longer the young stallion who had terrified handlers and destroyed stable walls. His muzzle had grayed slightly, and he moved with the measured pace of an elder statesman, rather than the explosive energy of his youth. But his eyes remained bright and knowing, and his presence still had the power to calm even the most troubled souls. He had become the heart of the sanctuary, a living symbol of redemption that inspired everyone who met him. Veterans would sit in his stall and pour out their hearts to him, and Angel would listen with that patient, understanding gaze that seemed to see past words to the wounds beneath. Sam, now 68 years old, had found a peace he had never thought possible. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were quieter now, less frequent, easier to bear. He had a purpose that got him out of bed every morning and a community that valued his presence. He had friendships, real friendships, built on shared experience and mutual respect. And he had Angel, always Angel, the constant presence that had anchored him through every storm and every triumph. On this particular morning, Sam had risen early to spend time alone with his old friend before the day's activities began. They stood together at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun rise over the hills, painting the world in shades of gold and pink. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds greeting the new day and horses stirring in their stalls. It was a perfect moment, one of countless perfect moments that Sam had learned to recognize and cherish. "You know, Angel," Sam said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "When I found you, I thought I was saving your life. Took me a long time to realize you were saving mine." Angel turned his great head and pressed his muzzle against Sam's chest, breathing warm air onto his weathered hands. It was the same gesture he had made 1,000 times before, but it never lost its power to move Sam to his core. In that simple touch was everything they had shared: the fear and the trust, the struggle and the triumph, the healing that had come from two broken souls choosing to believe in each other. Sam wrapped his arms around Angel's neck and held him close, feeling the steady beat of the horse's heart against his own chest. He thought about all the veterans who would pass through these gates in the years to come, all the wounded warriors who would find hope in the presence of horses who had also known suffering. He thought about the legacy they were building, the lives they were changing, the proof they were offering that it was never too late for redemption. "Thank you," Sam whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Thank you for everything." Angel nickered softly in response, and together they stood in the golden morning light, man and horse, two souls that the world had called worthless and dangerous, standing as living proof that love could conquer fear, that patience could overcome pain, and that sometimes the things we label as demons turn out to be angels in disguise. The story of Sam Walker and the black horse called Demon had become a legend in their small community, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. But for Sam, it was more than a story. It was his life, his purpose, his redemption. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to honor the promise he had made on that rainy night so many years ago. He would continue to believe in the forgotten ones, the broken ones, the ones the world had given up on. Because he knew, better than anyone, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past the darkness to find the light within. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us what touched your heart most, and share where in the world you're watching from. Stories like these remind us that compassion can change lives, and that every creature, no matter how broken, deserves a chance at love.